Welcome to Camera Basics Workshop. So, in photography, we have three very important tools, and they're called the exposure triangle. We have our camera aperture, our shutter speed, ISO, and then, if you want, you also want to think about composition. It takes time to learn how to be a good photographer. It takes time, patience, practice. And I say this again, practice, practice, and practice. Okay? In in this class, you're going to be doing a lot of photography. And in order to be really good at photography, you do have to practice. Henri Cartier-Bresson once said, "Your first 10,000 photographs are your worst." Do you agree with that statement? Do you think that you need to take at least 10,000 photos in order to be a good photographer? Maybe he was over exaggerating. But the truth is, you do need to take photos, and not just one or two, but a lot of photos in order to get better. Let's look at equipment. Now, everyone would love to own a digital SLR. That's a nice camera body here on the right, and at the bottom we've got some nice lenses that will attach to this digital single lens reflex camera. In this photo, we have a 24 to 70 millimeter and a 24 to 105 millimeter. These are standard zoom lenses. Anything that is over 70 millimeters is considered a telephoto lens. Anything that is lower than 35 millimeters is considered a wide angle lens. Phone cameras tend to be wide angle lenses, but you can also go into portrait mode, which will set your focal length at about 70 millimeters. But usually, a phone camera will be at about 35 millimeters, which is a wide angle lens. A flash can also be attached to the top of the camera. At the very top, you'll see what's called a hot shoe. That's right here. Okay, and you can see that these little bottom parts of the flash will attach to the hot shoe. And this can be very essential for indoor shooting. So let's take a moment and let's think about the exposure. So we have what's called the exposure triangle. There are three main functions of this exposure triangle. They are ISO, International Standards Organization, aperture, and shutter speed. All three of these will impact your exposure. And where do we look? Well, on a digital SLR, we will look at the exposure compensation meter, which is right here, and this is what it looks like. When it's in the middle, it's 0, and that means that your camera is set to the proper exposure. If it goes +1 or +2, it means that you are overexposing. If you go -1 or -2, it means you are underexposing. You always want to try to be here in the middle on 0 because that means that you have the proper exposure. Let's look at this little diagram over here. So aperture has to do with your lens. On your lens, you have a diaphragm, or what's called an aperture, that will open or close. When it's at 1.4 or 2 or 2.8, the aperture is open the widest. When it's at f8, f11, f16, the aperture is at the smallest size. You could see here in the diagram, it goes from large to small. Shutter has to do with the speed or how fast the camera is. So at 1/8 of a second, it's very slow, and so you get a lot of blur. At 1/60th of a second, it depends on how fast you're moving. You might get some blur if you have a very fast moving subject. At 1/1000th of a second, you're going to probably capture your emotion and action. It's going to be very sharp. It's just going to be like a quick shot, and it's going to capture the action perfectly without any blur. Let's look at ISO. 100, all the way up to 12,800. ISO impacts the visual noise. So when you're at 100, you have very low visual noise. If we look at that diagram, we can see that the bike is very crisp and clear. As you move across to the larger numbers, you're going to notice that the bike becomes a little bit what we call visual noise. It's we see little dots, we see pixels, and it's not totally clear, not totally sharp, and that's due to the visual noise. So you can compensate all these to get a proper exposure, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. Okay. So we're actually going to be playing with a really cool online link that will let you experiment with the exposure triangle. Okay, so if we click on this link right here, it'll take us to our Canon camera simulation. Okay, and basically, here's our exposure compensation that I was talking about earlier. Here's aperture, here's our shutter speed, and here's our ISO. So I'm going to have you play with these, okay? All right, so we're going to be doing 1/90th of a second, 2.8, and 200. So let's come over here and we're going to put those in. 2.8, 1/90th of a second, ISO 200. It looks like we're going to have a shallow depth of field because of what the picture effects are showing us here. We're going to have some blur motion with the propeller, and we're going to have a nice sharp image in regards to the ISO. Now we're going to click on the camera. You're going to hear a clicking noise, and it's going to take a picture. And guess what? It did exactly what it said it was going to do. It said that we're going to have a shallow depth of field. We're going to have some blur motion with the propeller, but everything's going to be pretty visually sharp in regards to the visual noise. So now what we're going to do is we're going to right click on this, copy image, come over to our project here. We are going to right click here and we're going to click on Control V, and we're going to resize this and put this right over here. And then we're going to explain the results. We're going to explain the results of these settings. As you do this, I want you to pay attention to depth of field. I want you to pay attention to what happens to the motion, to digital noise, and I want you to pay attention to these picture effects. Okay, so if we come back here, here's the picture effects. Okay, so as we start to adjust these, right over here on the right side, you're going to see how the depth of field changes. Okay, as you adjust the shutter speed, you're going to notice down here on motion what happens to the image as you move to the left or move to the right. If we adjust the ISO, we're going to notice what happens to the digital noise. Either it's sharp or it starts to kind of get pixelated. Okay? So you're going to adjust these. And also after you're done doing all your adjustments, I want you to look at what the picture effects are going to be for these particular settings. And I want you to note those picture effects, okay? All right, so go ahead and put this on pause and continue with this slide. All right, so now I'm going to have you go to the next slide. Do the same thing. I'm going to have you adjust to these settings that you see for 4, 5, and 6. And again, you're going to make note of the depth of field, the motion, the digital noise or visual noise, and you're going to make note of the picture effects once you make these different setting adjustments. All right, so now we're going to go into a little more in depth these different settings, like the exposure triangle. Today, we're going to focus right now on exposure. We're going to look at a couple of possible scenarios. So let's say we have our camera set to f8 at 1/60th of a second at an ISO of 200. Let's say you want to change your f-stop to f16. You will have to adjust the shutter speed down by 2 stops to let the same amount of light in. Okay? So that means that if you're going to have it set to f16, we have to adjust this down by 2 stops. So it would go from 1/60th of a second down to 1/30th and then down to 1/15th of a second. That is a total of 2 stops. And our ISO will stay the same. All right, let's try another possible scenario, but this time we're going to split the difference across both the aperture and the shutter speed. So let's say we have it set to f8 at 1/60th of a second and the ISO is at 200. Let's say we want to change the ISO to 800. That's the difference of 2 stops. So that means if we were going to split it between the f-stop and the shutter speed, we're going to have to adjust by 2 stops. So we have to compensate by bringing our f-stop down 1 stop. So then the next stop would be f11. So since we're adding in more light at 800, because 800 is ISO, it has more light sensitivity, we're going to have to bring our exposure down by 2 stops, okay? So that means that we need to adjust our f-stop to 11. And we also need to make our shutter slightly faster. So that will then go to 1 and 1/25th of a second. Okay, so we've adjusted this by 1 stop, we've adjusted this by 1 step down, and that will compensate for the fact that we've now moved this up to 800, which is a 2-stop difference, allowing more light sensitivity. And this is called splitting the difference across both the aperture and shutter speed. So let's play with aperture a little more. A large aperture is represented by a very small f number, such as 1.4, 2.8, and f4. That means that your aperture diaphragm is very large in your lens. It's allowing in a lot of light. A small aperture is represented by a large f-stop number, such as f16 or f22. This means the diaphragm on your lens is very, very tiny and it's not allowing in very much light. A large aperture, such as f2.8, will give you a very shallow depth of field, meaning that not very much is in focus. An aperture such as f22 will give you a much broader depth of field. In other words, a shot taken at f2.8 or f5 will have much less in focus than an image that is shot at f22. So let's look at these two images over here on the right. One image was shot at f8 with a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second of an ISO of 200. Everything is pretty much in focus. The roses and the cherry blossoms in the background. If we look at the image on the right, image number 2, f2.8 is a much more larger aperture, but also much more shallow depth of field. The shutter speed is 1/250th of a second, and the ISO is 200. So what we have here is the roses are still sharp, but the cherry blossoms in the background are out of focus. Let's look at shutter speed a little closer. Shutter speed can be 1/160th of a second, 1/1000th, or even you can even set it to bulb, which will let you once you have your camera set to bulb, you can turn it on and keep it open as long as you need. A fast shutter speed is 1/4000th of a second. But it doesn't let in very much amount of light. It lets in a very small amount of light. A slow shutter speed could be like 5 seconds long, but it lets in a very um a lot of light. Okay? So it's very very slow, so it's going to let in a lot of light. Okay? So, and if you're going to have these various shutter speeds, you have to compensate with your f-stop so that you have a proper exposure. So a small aperture such as f/22 would require a much longer exposure. It is needed to compensate for the small amount of light that's coming into the camera. So also, if you plan on holding your camera, you never want to have a shutter speed that is slower than 1/60th of a second. Otherwise, you're going to get what's called motion blur. All right, so let's look at these images here on the bottom. So we have our water droplet image on the left, photographed with a 100 millimeter macro lens. The ISO is set at 200. Now the shutter speed is 1/200th of a second. That's pretty fast shutter speed, especially if you're going to use a flash to help capture the motion, which is what was used here in this image. The f-stop is f8. So we got pretty much everything in focus. Now if we look at the image on the right, the f-stop is f9 with a 36-second exposure because this was taken at dusk just after sunset. So there was very, very little light. And so in order to compensate for that, we had to do a 36-second exposure with an f9, which meant that pretty much everything's in focus, ISO of 100, and a 57 millimeter lens was used, which is pretty much a standard lens. It's not really a wide angle lens, and it's also not really a telephoto lens. Let's talk about ISO. ISO measures the sensitivity of light. The larger the number, the more sensitivity. The lower the number, the less sensitivity. So a low ISO such as 100 is less sensitive to light than an ISO setting of 1600 or 3200. 3200 will result in a lot of noise in the image. If you look at the image on the left, we have less noise because it was shot at an ISO of 200. If we look at the image on the right, which was shot at an ISO of 800, there's a lot of visual noise. We can see those pixels in the image. So when would you want to use a high ISO? When it really doesn't matter. Let's say you only want to use the image on social media. You don't need to have a really high quality, sharp image. But let's say you want to print the image and make like a large print from it. Well, then you're going to want to have very low visual noise. You want the image to be really clear and crisp. So that's why you would want to use a 100 or 200 ISO. If you plan on printing a large image, if you plan on putting your image on social media and it's not a big deal, and you're, let's say, at a concert and you have hardly any light, then you're going to want to use like a 3200 or higher ISO. We're going to talk a little bit about white balance. So when you photograph inside with a tungsten light, like just a standard lamp, like you see here in this photograph, it can be very, very warm. So you can balance that in your adjustments. Once you go to edit your images, you can do some editing to balance that out a little bit. But typically, a lamp inside the house will create some very, very warm lights. If you're working with LED, you may find that the light is balanced for either warm or cool tones. If that's the case, then you'll get an image like you see on the right side, which is more of a cool, kind of more balanced image. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about composition, leading lines, thirds, and selective focus. What is a great composition? Generally speaking, a photo with great composition is one which draws the viewer in. So when you look at the image, you just can't look away. You're just fascinated by the artwork and it just grabs your attention. You can use the frame of the photo to guide the viewer's eyes to the main subject. So in this case, in this image here, these lines, these vertical kind of diagonal lines are drawing your eyes to the orange rose. It has become your main subject. It's the emphasis. But you do want to avoid distracting elements, anything that draws the viewer's eyes away. In this image, we are using these leading lines to draw your eyes to the rose. Rule of thirds. Rule of thirds is when you divide an image into thirds, such as you see here. You have intersecting lines. You want to place the main point of focus in your photo on one of those 1/3 frames. Okay, it could be to the right, it could be to the left, it could even have a subject that's in the middle. But you want to place your subject along these lines. So here, up here, somewhere. So our rose right here is mainly focused in this bottom 1/3 of the image. And this is also part of the designs, principles of designs of balance that we'll be learning about later. Select focus. You can use shallow depth of field, such as using an f-stop that is at 2.8, or you can put your phone camera on portrait mode and it'll help to create this shallow depth of focus. And it will help to direct the viewer's eye to the main point of interest in your image. So the main emphasis or your focal point. And it'll blur out everything else. So here in this image, the small rosebud is our main focus, and the larger rose in the background is out of focus. A strong composition can often be the most simple one. So in this image, we use the rule of thirds. The butterfly is on the right 1/3 of the image, kind of in the top middle. We have a shallow depth of field, so the background is all out of focus. And the fact that the butterfly wings are kind of broken is kind of interesting. You can tell that this butterfly has been on a long journey. You also want to fill the frame. By focusing in on a particular detail of a scene, you are able to fill the frame, and it can create an interesting composition. So you don't always have to just put the entire flower in the shot. You can actually cut part of it off. And in this case, we have part of the flower at the top cut off, and it's reflecting on some mylar that it's sitting on. And so the flower at the bottom is reflecting in the plastic. You can also use color and contrast to add strength to your image. You can do this through the editing process where you will add contrast, you can add hue saturation and intensity, you can adjust brightness and contrast, you can dodge and burn, you can use the cloning tool. These are all tools that you can use in your editing to help create contrast, brightness and contrast, hue saturation, to help strengthen your image composition.